Hi, thanks, Todd. First of all, I want to point out, Nate, thank you for answering all the hard questions and explaining all the difficult stuff. I'm going to go into the easier things to start off with here. So I'm going to talk about some results from our Cercospora leaf spot trials first. Then I'll go into the results from the fall leaf sampling that the agriculturalists do for resistance testing at Dr. Secor's lab. And then we'll go into the Cercospora leaf spot fungicide program for 2024. So we had 3 trials I'm going to talk about here in 2024. The first one is our fungicide screening trial that was located near Clara City. The fungicide screening trial, again, the purpose for that is to compare individual fungicides, whether there's some new fungicides that might be available coming up, or just comparing the effectiveness of current fungicides that are being used to let the growers know which ones are being effective alone to put them into a program. Because a lot of times it's hard to know if a fungicide's working really well when you test it in a program when it's applied once, out of 6 applications. The other 2 trials were located near Renville. One of them is a program trial, which is very similar to what you guys are doing out in the field, just with some different variations on the chemicals that are being used. And then the protectant fungicide trial, I was looking at some different protective fungicides that maybe aren't currently used, seeing if we could find some more effective tank mix partners to add to the DMIs or the tin applications. So before I get into the results, I just want to cover real briefly how the trials are conducted. I know many of you are very familiar with this, but if anyone's not, I'm just going to cover it briefly. Our Cercospora leaf spot trials are inoculated. So how we do that is we collect heavily infested leaves from the previous year. So this year we collected leaves from our nursery and our trials, and we'll save those over winter. And the next year, we grind them ahead of application to this material here. And then it goes on by a Gandy air unit, and we just blow that across the canopy so we get a nice even distribution when there's a dew, so that way it sticks to the leaves. And then that allows us to get a nice even disease pressure across the entire trial, which is really important when you are comparing plots that might span several hundred feet. We want to have even disease pressure, so we're comparing them apples to apples, so to speak, versus going off of a natural infection that might progress unevenly across the field. You also notice that we have a corn border here. That's to kind of help prevent the movement of the disease out of our trial area. It's worked really well for us in the past. We've had cooperators plant beets right on the other side of the corn, and we haven't had any issues. We also will destroy these beets after harvest and work under the inoculum as best we can too. For our fungicide applications, these are 6-row plots, and you can see here the sign that's in between rows 6 from the plot to the left and row 1 here for the plot that's currently being sprayed. So we straddle the center 4 rows for our fungicide application, leaving 2 rows untreated. These serve as a nice check kind of to see how the disease is progressing with no fungicide application, but also as a source of inoculum pressure throughout the season as they burn down from the Cercospora leaf spot. You also notice our sprayer here has some shields on the sides. This prevents the off-target movement of application A in this plot moving over or drifting into application or treatment B over here, just to make sure we get a good look at all these products without contaminating the treatments, and also allows us to spray, if there's a little bit of a crosswind, it's not going to have an impact on this application. And we're using flat fan nozzles. We're using CO2 as our pressure, going 60 psi, 20 gallons per acre. This is a drone image from the 2021 site. Forgot to take one this year, but this shows what I'm looking at pretty closely well here. You can see the plots, again, 4 rows of green beets there looking really nice, and then rows 1 and 6 there are burning down. So you can see that pattern throughout the field, just showing the nice even disease pressure and how well that shielded sprayer works on protecting those 2 rows that we're not trying to apply to. And you'll see here just that we have 4 reps, right? So that just means for all these trials, they're randomized trials, and each treatment appears 4 times in a trial, so we get a data point from 4 different plots. Just a reminder on the rating scale that we're using. So this is the KWS rating scale, 1 to 9. I know it's not that easy to see the spots on these leaves, but anyway, this is the rating scale we use. You guys are pretty familiar with it. And that's what the numbers you're going to see on the following slides. Before I get into the program trial, this was the fungicide recs from 2023. So just so you know what my treatments are in the upcoming slide. Remember, this is the traditional program and the HCT or CR Plus program. And my program will have both of these in there as the standard and then some different variations of this program. So this is the CLS program trial near Renville. You can see I have two different varieties. I have a CR Plus variety and then I have a traditional variety. This is that standard I was talking about for the traditional variety and the standard for the CR Plus program as well. So you can see we kept both those plots very clean, had less than a 2 rating for Cercospora early in September. Our traditional control down here is almost at a 9 here early in September. Something that some of us may find surprising is that the CR Plus control is also above a 5, and that's no fungicide applications on that CR Plus. These other programs here are just different variations again. The CR Plus here is sprayed with EBDC and a sulfur fungicide called microthiol disperse. And again, that's still got 4 applications on, it's just different fungicides. This one substituted the copper out for a sulfur, and then the traditional, we also use sulfur to replace our tin and copper fungicide applications. Overall, as long as we were spraying these plots, they all looked pretty good. This is the fungicide screening trial near Clara City. So again, we're looking at different products that are currently available for use that I'm showing here on the slide today. We did test some other products that are potentially up and coming, and I won't show those today because they're not labeled for use. We have tin at the top here, followed by our smattering of our DMI products. Our control here at the bottom, you can see at this time when the ratings are presented, we have a 9 for our control. The Manzate Pro Stick and Proline applied alone, fairly high ratings, a little bit above a 4 and a 5 for those applied alone. However, when we tank mix them, we are seeing a very good control, the best control in the trial at a 2. If you look at the letters indicating differences in significance, if they share a letter, they're similar, right? So several of these are very similar to Manzate and Pro Stick. Not a lot of differences here. You can see Enable is a little bit worse than some of them. However, it's still similar to Provosol, Minerva, and Tin. So not a lot of differences overall comparing our Triazole products and Tin in this fungicide program. Moving on to the protectant fungicide trial. So again, looking at some different products that you guys might not be as familiar with or aren't currently using. So we have microthiol disperse, which is that sulfur fungicide that I mentioned earlier, and Cooperfix Ultra is a basic copper sulfate. These are both labeled in sugar beets. And then we're comparing those to some that are more commonly used. We got Proline and Manzate Pro Stick out there, and then doing some different tank mix combinations to compare them. Again, our control here is at a 9 at the time these ratings were taken, early September. And the Manzate and Pro Stick alone, again, not looking that great by themselves, around a 5. Tank mix them together around a 2.5. Things to point out that were a little surprising to me was that Cooperfix Ultra had a similar performance to Proline and Manzate Pro Stick. So that is a copper fungicide that had similar performance to these other 2 products that are mainstays in our fungicide program right now. Another thing that's interesting to point out is that we did see really good control when we tank mixed the Cooperfix Ultra with Proline and Manzate Pro Stick. Not quite as good as the Proline and Manzate, but very good tank mix combination. Microthiol disperse, it does have fungicidal properties against Cercospora leaf spot. It is not the primary use for it. It's used against powdery mildew in some other areas. When you tank mix it with these other products, we didn't see much additional control when tank mixed with Proline, but we did see a little benefit when tank mixing with Manzate Pro Stick. So just a little summary from that trial. Again, Cooperfix Ultra, a basic copper sulfate, provides similar disease control. Microthiol disperse, does provide some disease control, but not as well as other products tested in this trial. The variability in copper fungicide performance could be due to it's a function of formulation and possibly environment, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. And I think it warrants some further testing to be done here in 2024. So moving on to fall leaf sampling. So just a reminder, this is the ag staff when they go out in the fall and try to find a Secaucus release spot, and this year was rather difficult, having to go through a lot of fields to collect samples and send those up to the lab. And Dr. Secord tests these samples and develops our test for the resistance profiles for us. So I'm going to go through each of these. The first one is QOI. You can see that we still had very high levels of resistance, just looking across the last decade here on the x-axis, and nothing really to note of any consequence here other than they're still resistant. Looking at the DMIs or the triazoles, again, this is a percent of field samples that were had an EC50 value greater than 10. Now we're not comparing the individual fungicides against the others here because the EC50 values are all a little different, so we're not comparing them. But instead, we're looking at the trend for each fungicide over time, right, to see how they've performed in the past versus last year. So Inspire and Provosol, very similar resistance in 2023, a little bit lower than the previous 2 years. Proline and then Minerva or Domark, pretty similar to the last couple of years, not a lot of changes there. So I showed this slide last year when we were talking about changing the fungicide program for 2023, and I just want to talk about the history, right, behind why we were making a change. So I just want to refresh everyone on what occurred in the past that led us to make some changes. So if we look at this side of the graph, we can see in the 98 and early 2000s, we had a fairly high level of resistance to tin. But what happened here in the 2000-2004 time periods, we had the release of some new fungicides, right? We had Gem, Headline, and some others that were released and reduced the amount of tin that we were using, so reduced the selection pressure on tin, and we saw that subsequent decline in resistance to tin. However, what happened here in 2015 is that we had, as you know, the loss or effectiveness of strobilurin products, and so that put more pressure on tin and also the triazoles, and resulted in that increased resistance that we saw to tin. However, Nate also showed earlier already that this is data from Red River Valley and us, that the amount of resistance declined drastically from the last 2 years here at that 100 or 99%, all the way down to 30% across those growing areas. On the next slides here, I'll get to the individual SMBSC data. Oh, you can just skip through those. That was just reminders for when you. Okay, here we go. So for SMBSC, this is specific to our growing area. Again, we saw very high levels of fields that had spore germination that were resistant to tin at that 1 ppm. And that dropped down to below 10% for 2023. So very dramatic decline in resistance. This is looking at severity of that resistance. So this was incidence, the number of fields, and this is the severity of that resistance in those samples. And we can see that also dropped dramatically from that 65-60% here in the last 2 years down below 10% for 2023. So a dramatic drop in incidence and severity for resistance to tin. Before I get into the program, I want to talk about a few other things, and Ashok already mentioned that we are seeing a little bit more of other foliar diseases. So on the in the red here we have Secaucus leaf spot, and in the yellow we have alternaria, and they might be somewhat easy to tell apart, you know, when I have arrows pointing at them telling you which one's which, right? But when you're out in the field trying to collect samples, these are fairly hard to tell apart, and if there's not a lot of CLS out there, you might confuse the two if you don't have a side-by-side comparison. So we saw quite a few alternaria samples from this year's fall leaf sampling. And I'll touch on why that's important later in the program. Looking at our triazole or DMI product groups, Nate again already touched on this. We have our Proline and Minerva or Domark, Inspire XT or Provosol, and then so we know that there's cross-resistance in these first two groups, right? And this third group here with Lucento, Topguard, or Enable, as Mike pointed out, we don't know, right? There hasn't been a lot of resistance testing done with these products. However, in looking at historical data and some conversations with Nate, it appears, we're not sure, but it looks like we have some similar resistance for Enable with the Proline Domark group. So unfortunately, that means that Enable We're going to validate this with some more testing, but we believe right now that Enable fits best with the resistance profile, unfortunately, to Group 1. So that Proline, Domark, Minerva. It's unfortunate. It'd be great if we would know that there's a third group that has a different resistance profile, but right now we don't know with Lucento or Flutriafol, the active ingredient, if that's a different group or if it falls into one of these other two. But right now, this is our best understanding is that Enable fits in with those two. So looking at the Ag Practice database for 2023, this is the percent of triazole use for our growing area. You can see we have a pretty heavy use of Proline at 44%, and that's just of the DMI applications, right? This isn't a percent of all the applications. Enable's at 27%, and then we have a smattering of the other products there. If you look at the triazole use by group, however, we can see that for that first group, we used about 76% of our applications were from that group with Domark, Minerva, Enable, or Proline, which would have looked a little more even from 2023 if we would have understood that Enable might be more similar to Proline. So that's really nobody's fault as far as going out and spraying the same group. That was something we just didn't really know or understand. So we got 21% for Inspire XT or Provosol, and then that 3% for Lucento or TopGuard. So based on triazole use from the previous year, that's something you're going to want to consider moving forward into 2024, is how much of this first group were you using compared to the others. Also just want to touch on the use of copper products. Most copper products are a fixed copper as the active ingredient. There's one that's not. It's a copper sulfate pentahydrate. That formulation is not a fixed copper, and it's very soluble, so it's really easy to mix into a tank, right? It looks a little more clear, a lot more friendly to rinse out the jugs. We did a test in 2018 with a few different copper fungicides. That one in particular was ETF as the pentahydrate, and it did have significantly more disease than the other copper products tested. However, the disease in that trial overall was fairly high. So residual activity for copper, how those are formulated, they release copper ions over time when they're in the presence of water. So having a year like 2023 where we didn't have a lot of heavy rainfall events in our trial, but more so, maybe a lighter rain or dew that's present, that was a good way to use a copper fungicide or make it more effective, is not to get washed off by a heavy rain, but just have those light dews and things to activate those ions. Word of caution in applying them, just the low pH increases solubility, so it won't last as long on the plant, but also it could have some potential for phytotoxicity. Last thing to note before I get into the program for 2024, the CR Plus trait is not immune to developing Cercospora leaf spot. We've shown that in our trial work, but it's also coming out in other growing areas. Areas that have noted issues are happened in Michigan, also in Germany. This picture here is actually from our growing area. So this is a southern Min field. This is a CR Plus variety, and it looks worse than my trial did, and I inoculated it. So if we don't spray our CR Plus fields, this is something that could happen if we do have inoculum present. So it's very important that we continue to spray our CR Plus fields. So this is the program for 2024. I'm going to walk through it, point out the similarities of 2023, but also some of the differences. So traditional program and the HCT or CR Plus program, again, we are wanting people to start early, approximately that 4 leaves apart, right? Nate touched on why this is important with the latent infections, right? When do those latent infections occur? Well, right there kind of in the last week or so of June, right, before canopy closure. And so we want to get out there before the canopy closes, get a product on, get good leaf coverage on all the leaves. Don't let that close up before we get a fungicide down to the lower leaves. Otherwise, we develop that microclimate that's really good for disease infection to occur. So we get that early app on, 7 to 10 days later, let's come back with a triazole plus an EBDC. And then after that, the program changes between the two varieties, right? So we have a shorter interval for the traditional program, 12 to 14 days later, and then the CR Plus, we're looking at that 24 to 28 day interval. Another difference from last year that you'll note is this tin in the CR Plus program. So there's a couple reasons behind why we wanted to consider putting tin back into the program. The first one being alternaria. So we saw an increase in observations of alternaria across the growing area. Nothing necessarily of concern, but it is something that we're seeing more of, and tin is a very effective fungicide against alternaria, probably one of the best ones that we're using currently for alternaria. So having it in there should help with that. But also we have a higher percentage of our fields being planted to CR+. We probably averaged 1.5 applications of tin on our traditional fields and a half of an application of tin on the CR+. And if we're going to be moving more to CR+ fields, putting one application of tin out there on those fields isn't really going to increase our exposure of tin to Cercospora leaf spot, because we're still only going to be averaging 1.5 applications total, with a higher percentage being CR+ fields. So we feel fairly confident that we can use tin in those CR+ fields. Another thing that is different from 2023 is we're not naming the particular triazole or DMI product that we want you to use in a particular order. We thought, based upon testing that's been done, that there was maybe some benefit to putting a particular triazole group on first, based on the in-season resistance testing. That may not be the case. We just really don't know or understand that quite yet. And so the more important thing is to know what was sprayed on the sugar beet field last in 2023 that's going to be near your field in 2024. So if your neighbor or it's your field next to your 2024 field, knowing what they sprayed last in 2023, we would recommend going to a different triazole group on 2024. So just making sure that you have an understanding of what was sprayed last around you. Again, so the CLS quick sheet is going to be available. It'll have the full program details. It's that front and back quick sheet that has the program on it, as well as information on all the products that are available for use and general best management practices for applications. You can find the CLS quick sheet on the website. It is posted. We checked on that, and the 2023 research report is also posted on the website, so you can view both of those. So just going into a few of those best management practices, again, starting early, right? Get those first 2 applications on, and after that, going out and making sure that you're scouting and watching disease index values, right? What's the weather like? Are we really prone to developing disease with high humidity and temps and moisture, right? When you're scouting, finding that first couple of spots is going to be really difficult in a drive-by, right? So going out in the field and checking those areas that might develop those microclimates. So maybe it's by a grove or a building site. Areas that retain the moisture or the dew longer is going to be the first spot you're going to find it. Or in areas where the sprayer might have a harder time getting a good coverage or application. Maybe it's around a telephone pole, or again by those building sites. Again, spray intervals dependent upon what variety you're planting and your DIVs, or what weather events have occurred. If you had a heavy rain 8 days after you applied, you might want to shorten that up and get in the field as soon as you can, compared to waiting to 14 days, right? Obviously, with something that we want coverage on, we're going that 20-25 gallons per acre. And depending upon your nozzles, making sure we follow our manufacturer's recommended pressures to get a medium droplet size. And then using a deposition aid to reduce the amount of driftable fines we have and get that spreadability on the canopy of the beets. So I wanted to show something again from the Ag Practice database from this last year. So from the respondents that we had, 72% used a flat fan nozzle. That provides excellent coverage, right? That's great. These other ones, most of them are fine too. Twin fan, Turbo T-Jet, Turbo Duo. Those are totally fine for these applications. They're great. Some of them apply in multiple directions, so you might get better coverage also. One of the things that is a little concerning is the air induction at 5%. All these nozzles are a little different depending on the manufacturer, so it's not necessarily a concern if it's a nozzle that works well for coverage. But in general, if you look at like an AIXR, it's going to produce a rather coarse droplet and not provide you with good coverage. So we paired the respondents' nozzle type with the pressure that they said they were using. And according to that, we had 36% of the respondents using a pressure above the recommended range for the nozzle that they were using. So that's a problem. right? If you're using a pressure above the recommended range for the nozzle, that could be causing a few issues with your spray distribution and pattern, for one thing, and causing more driftable fines, right? So that's not something you're going to want to do. And going into the next slide, I'll kind of explain a little bit of some of the issues there. So this is some data that we worked on with Winfield United back in 2019. So we sent them some different nozzles, pressures, and tank mixes that we wanted to test, looking at droplet spectrum. And so we tested a few things here, the AIXR, the Turbo T-Jet, and the XR flat fan. If we look at the left side here, we have microns less than 150. You could debate what that should be, but that's basically what I'm going to consider driftable fines. Something that might be prone to evaporation or just not getting down to the target in even a moderate wind. On the other axis, we have volume mean diameter, so what's the average size of your droplet that you're putting on. If we look at the AIXRs, you can see that we have a droplet range that's above 400. So for our medium droplet size, we're really looking for something from more like a 350 to 250, somewhere in there for that medium droplet size. So we're getting too coarse of a droplet here for good coverage, no matter what pressure you're using with your AIXR. Turbo T-Jet, you can see that we start out fairly high at a low pressure, but as we increase pressure, the volume mean diameter gets more into that medium droplet size range, so that's good. Unfortunately, as you increase pressure, you also increase your driftable fines. If we look at the XR flat fan here, even at a low pressure of 40 psi, we already have almost 12% driftable fines. If you increase pressure even more to 60 or 80, you can see just the increase here in driftable fines up to 19%. That basically means that when you're out there spraying, you might be losing 20% of your application that doesn't even get down to the canopy to do its job. So using a nozzle that's out of spec, which actually the XR is not supposed to be applied at 80 psi, that one maxes out at 60, you're going to get a lot more driftable fines, and you're also going to have pattern issues. So I just want to, I have a picture coming up too. So this is showing a picture of the XR at 20 psi, and this is with a different orifice size. That's an O2. So that'd be very similar to the O5 here at about 50 psi for droplet size. And so you can see the off target are the part of the spray here that's going to be drifting or moving off to the side, possibly evaporating, possibly just not making it down to the canopy. And so it's very important that we reduce the amount of driftable fines there. So I don't want to harp on this too much. I'm just going to say, don't use pressure to change your speed or your spray volume. Change your nozzle, right? Change your nozzle so you're getting in that medium droplet size without increasing your pressure too much. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Look at your manufacturer's guide for your nozzle and just make sure you're using it appropriately to get a good coverage and a good droplet size. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge our cooperators that we conduct these trials with. You know, without our cooperators, we aren't able to do these trials, so really appreciate that. And for the agriculturalists for going out and collecting all those leaf samples that we submit to the labs up in Fargo. That's very important for understanding what our resistant population is like. And for Dr. Wyatt and Dr. Secor's labs for really sifting through all that information for us. And for our industry partners for submitting products and ideas to us to test for Cercospora leaf spot to develop a better program for all the growers. With that, I will take any questions if I have time.
We got a few minutes. Any questions for Dave? Are we better off to be spraying in the morning with dews or in the afternoon with the heat?
So are we better off spraying in the morning with dews or in the afternoon with heat? I think it depends a little bit. You know, if it's a really heavy dew, you probably don't want to be applying to the point where you're going to have any sort of runoff, right? If it's a light dew, I don't think it's going to be an issue. It might even help your coverage a little bit, right? So that depends a little bit on the dew. As far as in the heat of the day, you're going to be more prone to evaporation from those driftable fines. So you got to kind of, assess the environment for the particular application. But obviously, a lower wind speed, lower heat, you're going to have less drift or less evaporation.
conventional sprayers and application and there, find any differences or nozzle recommendations or run into that?
So the question was about pulse width modulation nozzles and testing. We haven't done any of that testing ourselves. I don't believe that was a question in the database, so I don't really have any information on that. Other questions? Otherwise, I'll be around all day. So.
All right. Thank you, Dave.